Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 133 of Experience Data Talk podcast and video show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. My name is Mike Delgado, and today we're honored to chat with Dylan Doyle Burke and Jesse J. Smith, the founders and awesome hosts behind the Radical AI podcast. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to their show yet, please head over to your favorite podcast player and subscribe. They are interviewing the movers and shakers in data science and discussing ethical AI issues with people like Ruha Benjamin, Karen Howe, Mary L. Gray, and countless others. Their conversations are helping us all stay aware on how AI has been used to help and hurt marginalized communities. Now, what's funny about hosting a show with other podcasters is that I feel like added pressure to make sure that this sounds extra good. I'm spending a lot more time in editing and producing. Well, of course I had Wi-Fi issues and technology problems in today's show. So I apologize if you hear my questions get cut off. Thankfully, I got great audio from Dylan and Jess, and that's ultimately what matters. Before we get started, I want to share a little bit of background on both Dylan and Jess. Dylan is a PhD student in human-computer interaction and religious studies at the University of Denver. His research is focused on creating a theory of mind for artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence ethics. Dylan holds a Bachelor's of Arts from Sarah Lawrence College and a Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University. And Jess is a PhD student in the Department of Information Science at CU Boulder. Jess received her bachelor's in software engineering from California Polytechnic State University. Her research is on machine learning fairness, algorithmic bias, value tensions in socio-technical systems, and the unintended consequences of rapid tech growth. Here's our conversation. Dylan, Jesse, the Radical AI podcast. Thank you so much for being on Data Talk.
Of course, happy to be here. Thanks for having us on.
So I was scrolling through my Twitter feed and I found your podcast and I was like, what's Jesse doing? This is so cool. I always love discovering data podcasts and especially podcasts dealing with AI and current trends and topics that are important to all data scientists. And so I tweeted you guys, and you guys got back to me, and I was like, I would love to have you on the show. So I'm really excited to have you. And I thought today we'd just chat about your podcast, what you're currently doing. And I thought before we dive in, I would love to learn a little bit about your backgrounds. So maybe, Jesse, let's start with you. What are some things that you'd like to share with us and our audience about your background and what led you to get involved with the podcast?
Yeah, totally. So just for listeners too, I go by Jesse or Jess. Or both of those in different spheres just to avoid confusion. And my background is in software engineering. So I originally got my bachelor's degree in software engineering at Cal Poly, that's in Central California. And I was increasingly becoming pigeonholed into website development, which was a great career to go into, but it wasn't exactly calling my name, and it didn't really make me feel super fulfilled whenever I would be doing work or internships. So I was in about my third year of college when I was taking my first data science class, actually. And I took it at the same time as a computer ethics class. It was the first computer ethics class that was offered to me ever, and the only one, the only ethics type of class that was offered for anybody in the computer science department, which software engineering was a part of. And it was interesting because it's not even called computer ethics, it's called professional responsibilities because they don't want to scare the computer scientists away. And I was in the same day, I remember there's a specific day where I went to my data science class in the morning and they taught me how to build a web scraper and basically scrape all the data that you possibly want off of websites and people's profiles on social media and just get whatever data you want from the internet. And then that same day in the afternoon, I went to my computer ethics professional responsibilities class, and they basically said, here's why you shouldn't do that. And then I realized this is kind of weird that I'm learning these two things separately, and I only learned that I shouldn't do what I learned earlier today because I was taking this ethics class, and it kind of got me thinking, why am I not learning about the dangers of the coding that I'm doing in the classes where I'm learning the coding? So it kind of spiraled into this trajectory of responsible technology. And then I got really interested in machine learning. So I was going into machine learning fairness and bias. And I realized that if I wanted to do a career in this, it would make sense to go to grad school. So now I'm getting my PhD in information science, which is kind of like a combination of like computer science and human computer interaction, sociology, social sciences. And I'm kind of bringing all of that together and sort of going towards a trajectory that actually is to incorporate more ethics in the computer science classroom. So it's a little bit full circle. Yeah. Want to do more public scholarship, of course, and to teach people about the dangers of technology, not just the coders, but the public too. And so that's led to public scholarship in the form of blogs and YouTube channels and podcasts, which also led me to Dylan. And maybe Dylan wants to say a little bit about the podcast too.
So my name's Dylan, Dylan Doyle Burke. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Denver. I have a windy road. I'll try to keep it short for listeners, but basically I started my career as first a sociologist back in college, and then I was suddenly choosing between law school and between becoming a minister. And so I ended up going to go get my Master's of Divinity at Columbia, basically a Union
Oh,
Theological
wow.
Seminary at Columbia. And then I spent the next, like 8 years or so as a Unitarian Universalist minister. So I was ordained into that tradition. I spent multiple years in the hospital system as a chaplain, including serving in the burn unit
Oh,
and neuro
wonderful.
ICU. Yeah, and
Wow.
from there, took a new job out here in Denver, Colorado, looking at, well, I mean, it was in a congregation, but all of a sudden I ended up being the solo minister at this, like nearly 1,000 member congregation,
Wow.
which wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to be the second minister there. And because of a lot of different reasons, I realized that although there was still a lot that I loved about the ministry, it wasn't where I wanted to really make an impact. And I had grown up in a technological household. My mother had done tech ethics at a time where both tech ethics wasn't a thing that people did, and then also she was in a position of leadership in a place that women were not in a position of leadership generally in the 90s, early 2000s in the tech boom. And so I kind of saw firsthand at some of the, I don't want to say evils, but some of the ways in which these systems in the tech field and industry are keeping folks down who don't look like me, who aren't straight white men, right, in that field. And so I kind of have a personal either vendetta or story, depending on how you want to questions of like representation and things like that. But I started I started doing some consulting work in the area in Denver, Colorado, with some small startups in tech and AI specifically, really helping folks, which is sometimes confusing to folks because it's like, well, you were doing ministry, like how did those
Yeah.
things intersect? So
Yeah,
really my
yeah.
job was to help companies with their vision and mission, because it turns out no matter where you're at, no matter what system you're in, especially in organizations, you're kind of asking the same questions. Like, what am I doing? What's my purpose? How am I going to do it well? How am I going to do it ethically? And it goes from there. And so while I was doing that, I realized that I really wanted to kind of take this and run with it. And so I went to go get my PhD. But technically, I'm actually in religious studies right now. And applying religious studies, and we can talk more about this if you want to, but talk more about like the religious studies aspect and how we apply that to AI ethics. So while I was doing that in my first year of PhD of trying to figure out what the heck religious studies had to do with AI ethics, I attended a conference out in Barcelona. At the time, it was called the Fat Star Conference. Now it's called the FACT Conference, and it's about fairness, accountability, and transparency. And lo and behold, Jess was presenting at that conference, and she mentioned in her intro that she was studying at CU Boulder, and I was like, well, that's right up the road for me. So when we got back into town, we connected, and basically, so Radical AI is a podcast, and also we're moving towards being a nonprofit organization, where we're really focusing in on accessibility of tech ethics, but specifically lifting up voices that have been historically marginalized in tech spaces. So specifically Black voices, specifically women, and folks who you may not see, or at least historically have not seen on the panel discussions at some of these, major conferences, or who are publishing and things like that. And our premise is basically that it's one of frustration, right? Because these voices have always been there, but they haven't necessarily gotten the platform. And I think now we're finally at a reckoning point. And one of the things that has been so exciting and successful for Jess and I has been just how interested people are in these stories that we're trying to bring to the forefront. People are really hungry for these, like right now, especially. And so, again, we're happy to talk more about the podcast, but that's kind of the premise of the podcast as well. We've been around just since April of this last year. So we're recording this at the tail end of August 2020. We launched in April, and it's grown in a rate that we just had never expected. So it's wonderful to be able to talk about that as well.
Well, it's awesome. I'm grateful to have you on the show. And I think right now, especially in light of George Floyd being killed and the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement and the work that you're doing to help to raise up these very important voices during this time, how have the social issues, especially right now during COVID-19, impacted the work that you're doing with Radical AI podcast?
Oh, so much. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting, almost like a catch-22, because on the one hand, obviously we don't want tech controversies to happen, and we don't want terrible things to be shown in the news. We don't want tech companies to do bad things. But then on the other hand, a lot of that's happened recently, and we have a lot of stories to cover, and we have a lot of stories to tell that people have been going through. And so just even at the start of the pandemic, we interviewed Seda Gerses, who's this expert on surveillance and privacy. And that was right when Apple and Google decided to partner to promote the contact tracing app through our devices. And so that was something that's really scary for everybody to kind of try to figure out. But then through this interview with Seda, we're able to dissect, okay, what are the things we should actually be worrying about? What's actually going on? And how can we tell the public what they should know and what they can do? And how can we try to use these stories and these events that are kind of fear-inducing and fear-mongering and make them something that's a little bit more digestible and something that helps people feel like they can take action and not just feel powerless to the machine. So that's been really nice. And it was the same thing, I mean, going from COVID to all of the protests and kind of experiencing this reckoning that was happening in the US and also just the world globally, and then talking to amazing scholars like Timnit Gebru and Yeshi Milner, who's in charge of data for Black Lives. And Timnit is one of the co-founders of Black in AI, and just hearing their personal lived experiences about what is not only going on right now, but what's been going on for years, decades, centuries, and to really just have them lay it all out there. And it's been interesting for Dylan and I too, because I mean, we're two white folks who are trying to help build a platform that is, lifting up the voices of people who are usually not white. And so we want to be able to take a step back and let them tell their lived experiences, and we don't want us to be the center of it. And I think it's been really humbling for us to experience that.
Yeah, I guess I would add that, so one thing that you might gather from Jess and I's background is that we come from very different places and very different disciplines. So Jess is obviously a very talented computer scientist, and I'm coming now from the humanities, previously from social sciences. And I think one thing that we connected on pretty much immediately was that data is social, right? Like this AI thing that we're talking about and this like tech ethics thing, there's something fundamentally social about it. And that a lot of the harms that have been caused in the past have been through these myths of objectivity, or these myths of, well, you have technology out there and that's doing great stuff, but like the social is over here and there's a line separating those. And really where we start from this is that, no, these are social things that are happening. And yes, there's design implications. The tech is really important, but you can't talk about the tech without talking about the social. And I think that's something that Jess and I both collaborate on, and then also from our specific disciplines kind of add to one another in that. And so when we started this podcast, right, it was right before COVID happened. The pandemic started really ramping up, and it was basically in the midst of George Floyd's murder. And it has deeply touched kind of what our vision is and what our mission is in this work. We definitely view this as justice work, also public scholarship, and that we're really trying to, by decentering ourselves to the degree that we can, like to really highlight what is happening on the ground in a way that is accessible. Because I think the other premise of our show is that even when you look at other podcasts, right, they have very specific audiences in mind. And what we noticed when we were starting this is that the specific audiences were either hyper technical or like hyper philosophical or hyper whatever. And there wasn't a space for like to get real with these issues, if you will. So that's why we focus so much on stories of our guests and really start there, because we really want people to feel empowered in these spaces, and that's through education and then also like really knowing what the urgency is and what's happening on the ground. So that's, I think, a little bit more about how we approach those social issues. Yeah.
I love that. And I love like just your two different points of view, how you're both coming at it with the same compassion from the data side, the technology side, and also from the human and social justice side, like taking those two together and then finding the best and brightest voices to talk and address these issues. What have been some of the big topics as you have been like just focused on this space? What have been the big topics you've been focused on, like trying to raise up more voices, more discussions?
Oh, so many. For anyone listening, you can go to radicalai.org and look at all the topics. Yeah, it's kind of been all over the place. There's definitely, I mean, the usual topics in the AI ethics space are bias, fairness, accountability, transparency. That's like the whole FACT acronym too. So that's always sort of a central focus of a lot of these conversations. And then more recently, we've been diving into some more niche topics. Like we just recently did a week of AI for social good. We've talked a lot about racial representation, gender bias, and privacy, surveillance. What else jumped in here, Dylan? There's so many.
Yeah. No, I think an interest, like a helpful framing, perhaps, is what we mean by radical as well. So we call this thing a Radical AI podcast, and what we mean by radical, and this is through having a lot of conversations with people and really asking our guests what they mean by radical, because we didn't want to. We envisioned this project originally as like co-defining what radical AI is, because we inherited that tradition. Like that isn't something that we're continuing the conversation, but that terminology has been around for a while. But for us, what we mean by it is that we're really getting to the root of something. And also there's a level of like provocation to it as well. So really we've been going to where there has been energy out into the community of conversations to talk about. And originally we started just focusing in on artificial intelligence, but that boundary is so amorphous between AI and technology, and so we have morphed into more of kind of an educational platform around tech ethics in general. But that whatever, basically our topics, the way we choose our topics, to peel back the curtain a second, is either folks who like we've really looked up to, who are like, "Will you come on our show?" And sometimes they say yes, which is wonderful. Yeah. Or when we're on Twitter and there's like something trending in the community that people seem like are really up in arms about. So like when Microsoft and other companies started coming out in the fallout of George Floyd's murder about facial recognition technology, we got in touch with someone named Deb Raji, who is just wonderful in this space and is doing some work with the Algorithmic Justice League and some other groups. And we just wanted to pull her in as an expert to talk to our community about like what this means, like what should we know about this, and part of it also as PhD students, like we're really curious about it. So we're trying to follow the energy of where that goes, but then there are some overarching themes as Jess laid out that we're trying to kind of stay within, because you can go anywhere with this stuff. That's the crazy part. This field is still so much in construction right now of like even ethics, like ethics versus responsible AI versus all these different terms that we can throw out there. So it's very alive what those topics are.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, actually, is, I mean, we're defining like radical in AI and trying to figure out what that means with all of our guests in our community, but we're also trying to figure out what ethics means too in this space, because especially when it comes to computer scientists, and I feel like maybe I can say this because I identify as a computer scientist. Computer scientists are pretty scared of the word ethics. Like my ethics class wasn't even called an ethics class, right? And so
Right.
there's something about that word that it just has like so much baggage. And if we want to actually share this information and these messages and this research with communities that are both in computer science and the social sciences and industry and the academy and just, you know, the regular person who maybe doesn't exist in any of those, then we kind of have to take that baggage away from the word ethics. And that's, you know, it's interesting because part of me has also wondered if maybe we shouldn't call ourselves an AI ethics podcast because of that. Maybe we should call ourselves like a responsible AI podcast or like a technology and society podcast, because I think that's more the topics that we discuss. It's not really about what's right or wrong. It's more about, you know, recognizing that technology is not neutral, even though a lot of people think that it is. But because it's not neutral, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad either, though many people have opinions and research and facts to support why certain technologies might be good or bad. And so it's up to us to really just relay the facts and the information and the stories and the lived experiences, and then let the general public decide for themselves what is good or bad and what they can do with that. And I think that's more where this ethics word lies when it comes to our AI ethics podcast. It's less about us prescribing what is right or wrong to the community and more us giving just a bunch of information and then, and kind of just letting the general public decide for themselves how these technologies interact with their lives and with society and what we should do with that.
And how do you like as these different ethical issues are coming up, like how are you navigating them? Because it can be very complicated when you see both sides, because you're trying to weigh the different opinions. You're wanting to make the most compassionate, moral choice on the way to go, but it can get very, very complicated. I think about just in the case of the COVID-19 data, how as it spreads, and whether countries should be sharing that data with each other, and how much of the data should be shared. Because it's like human data, it's private data. At the same time, you're trying to solve a global pandemic to save lives. And so sometimes in these ethical dilemmas, like you see both sides. And so I think it's awesome that you guys are like at the forefront, like, let's discuss this, let's talk about the issues. At the same time, you're trying to navigate in your mind, like, what do I really think about this? How am I going to be processing this in real time as you're hosting a show about the topic? I'm just kind of curious, like, how you're kind of navigating it, because it's super hard.
Yeah, I think that one of the beautiful things about doing a podcast is that we don't have to have the answers. Is that part of our role, part of how we envision our role is what Jess was talking about, which is putting out the pieces for people to then be able to interpret. One of the great things about when we're putting our podcast hats on, right, is that we're not the people out there that then have to make all the hard decisions, which is not to abdicate, right, responsibility. Yeah. To say that that's not necessarily our role in that moment.
Yeah.
At the same time, we also wear other hats, right, in our different fields, which do have real design implications, and so we do have real thoughts about like what, I guess, biases, right? We have real biases that we're bringing in to these conversations about biases.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I would say is, and this is coming from the humanities perspective in me, and then maybe Jess can talk to the computer science area, is that I definitely take more of like a heart-centered approach to these things. So I always start, even when we're talking to people that like we might not agree with, or when we're hearing stories of companies that are causing real harm to real people in real time, that I try to start from a place where I don't think it's generally intentional, right? I think in very few cases, people are intending to cause immense amount of harm against hundreds of thousands of people, even in terms of facial recognition and things like that. So I try to start with compassion, and then I also try to look at a systems approach for that. So these systems are all being inherited. How we design technology now are coming from design practices that have existed for hundreds of years, a lot of them coming out of the Enlightenment. And within the Enlightenment, there were plenty of elements of colonialism and of racism and all of these isms, sexism, etc., that are still present. This is my belief, right? I'm speaking for myself, not necessarily the podcast. It's still present in all of these different systems today, because how could they not be, right? They're how we got to the spot, especially when we start talking about capitalism and capitalistic systems. And so all of that goes into our data design. So how do we have that systems approach, that more nuanced approach, that might be less like, oh, I need to feel awful and shut down about this, but more we can have a conversation, a real conversation about what's brought us to this point, and then how do we want to do things differently? And for me, I begin that conversation from that heart-centered place of compassion, or at least I try to. Sometimes it's tough, but I try to.
Yeah, I think from my end, I tend to think a lot about the what do we do with this now piece, because I think especially as a public facing platform, Dylan and I don't want to ever prescribe, kind of like I was saying before, we don't ever want to say, well, we had this guest come on and they said that we should always use AI to solve all social problems. So this is what we're going to tell everybody that they should do in the entire world. That's not really what we want to do. We instead just kind of want to give the information to the public and then, like I was saying before, let them figure out what they want to do with it, with maybe giving them some specific action items. And it really just depends on the problem too. So I have some specific examples of some hard value ethical trade-offs that we've run into before on this show. And the first one, the example that you kind of asked about, was with this contact tracing, because as Americans, it's kind of a part of our value system that we're raised in to like viscerally respond negatively to anything that infringes on like our freedom. And a lot of that has to do with anything that infringes on our rights to privacy. And so you think about contact tracing and how so many Americans immediately just push back on that and want to riot in the streets because they don't want our information to be shared, especially with the government. But then I talked to some of my colleagues who are from places like China, where their value systems and what they were raised believing are so different when it comes to privacy. And this isn't even just with contact tracing. This is true of the social credit system too, which Americans seem so adamantly against. But then people who are raised in communities that care a little bit more about a like communal approach towards values and ethics, they actually don't really care about holding on to their privacy quite as much. So it's not really a negative thing to them, but it's negative for us. And so, like Dylan was saying, we have to constantly check our biases and ask, well, should we tell people that this is a bad technology because we feel so strongly about privacy? Or should we tell them this is an infringement on privacy? How you feel about privacy is how you feel about whether this is right or wrong. And that's like a pretty clear-cut and dry example of two different communities feeling something differently or even opposing. And then you think about something like facial classification and facial recognition software, like we were talking with Deb Raji about, and that one's even more difficult because you have, even just taking the United States, you have facial recognition and classification algorithms that are honestly like blatantly discriminating against people of color. And they're way less accurate for people of color. And so you can call the algorithm racist, even if it's intentional or unintentional. And so many people would immediately probably jump to that and say, well, we need to fix this algorithm. We need to make it less racist. We need to make it just as accurate for all people of all types of races and all types of skin colors. And then when you talk to people like Deb Raji, you realize, well, okay, if you make the system and the facial recognition model accurate for everyone, well, then there's more unintended consequences and racist implications there, because then we can help the police over surveil communities that were already being over policed and communities that are already marginalized. And so there's some tensions with some of the possible like action items that come from these this different research that we're seeing people doing in these spaces. And so I think it's really difficult. It's not an easy answer. We don't really talk to these scholars and come out of these interviews with always like an immediate feeling of, yes, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, this is what we need to do, and this is what we're going to tell the community to do. Unless it's like something that's like clearly racist, then like I think there's a few things that Dylan and I can agree on we're going to promote and push for and tell people what is right and wrong, at least from our perspective and from the people that we're talking to and their perspective. But there's a lot of gray areas where we just really can't say what is right and wrong. And so, yeah, that's where the transparency comes in, I guess.
Yeah. I think that sometimes these conversations also can go into this spot where we say, oh, well, everyone's just trying their best, and like there's no responsibility, right? Or like, oh, we're just in this like incredibly intersubjective space, and there's no like these are the philosophers, right? There's no truth here whatsoever. Like, and I think that a lot of these scholars that are out there that we've interviewed, and that you've interviewed as well, like that there are some North Stars out there, right? Like the work that Timnit's doing at Google, the work that Jen Wortman-Vaughn, who we recently interviewed, is doing at Microsoft. Like there are these folks who have spent their careers as experts in this, who have pinpointed practical ways that we can move forward as a data science community, as a technological community. And it's going to be hard, and it's going to be an iterative process, and there are all of these different difficulties with it. But there are folks out there who have really defined what those North Stars are. So I don't think we want to come across saying that like, well, there's no North Stars, that we don't believe in, things like that. Like I think we fall in line with a lot of these folks who are out there leading the field in terms of responsible AI right now.
Well, I love the voices that you have in your show, and just from talking with you right now, just hearing how thoughtful you are. I'm curious about your advice for the technologist, for the computer scientist or data scientist who maybe is working at a company and struggling. Maybe they're working on a product or a solution where it's impacting them and making them have some questions around ethics. What would be your advice to them as they're maybe struggling, or even just having a question around, what do I really think about this particular issue?
I'll start off with this one as the labeled technologist of the two of us. And actually, I have a bit of a story here because I have experienced this before. And so I think my advice will kind of come from a place of like lived experience. And of course, it's not going to apply to everyone. But when I was working at a tech company a few years ago, it was right around when the GDPR just got launched, and that's the General Data Protection Regulations. I just butchered that name. It stands for something like that. It's about data privacy in the EU. And when this happened, a lot of different tech companies had to basically reinvent a lot of the things that they had for their data infrastructure systems to make them more privacy enabling for their users. And it was only required for people who were or for customers who lived in the EU. It wasn't required for American citizens. And so for the companies who weren't necessarily thinking ethically, they were thinking, okay, well, let's just make sure that we make private data infrastructure for all of our European users, and we'll just keep using what we're using for the American users, and we just won't be transparent about it so that nobody gets mad at us. And when I was working at this tech company, they were doing exactly that. And these were people that I had known a year earlier who were actually really into data privacy, but because of this regulation, they were angry about it because it made more work for them. And they felt like they were doing it out of compliance instead of out of what they actually wanted. And they were trying to basically just screw over the Americans as much as possible and trying to make, basically just trying to check off boxes instead of just doing what was right and what they had known to be right a year ago. And I felt really weird about that, and I didn't like their approach. And so I ended up going and talking to the person who was in charge of the GDPR transition. I can't remember the exact name for the project, but we had a long conversation about how we can teach the people in the company why the GDPR was important, why data privacy is really important for all the users, and why we should do this out of values instead of out of compliance, and why we need to remember that like this impacts people. These lines of code are not just code that we are writing that doesn't actually touch anyone or impact anyone, but this actually can have a really heavy impact on a lot of different people, even if we can't see their faces or know their names. And so I think my advice to anyone else who's feeling like they're in a situation whether they're feeling like they are powerless or in a place of power, if they just have like that feeling in the back of their mind, like something isn't right here, to speak to someone, not just to hold that in. And I know that this won't work for everyone because I've also had some colleagues who are in the tech industry who are working under like working visas, and they feel like a little bit more powerless because they're not able to really speak out or fight for these issues as much because they don't have as much freedom to lose their job. And so I understand that for everyone, this is going to be a little bit different and it's not going to be as easy. But if you are in a position where you do feel like you can speak to someone, whether it's people on your team, your manager, somebody who's your manager's manager, or even the highest boss in the company, whoever's high up there, speak to people about this and don't let these issues go unknown. And then another small piece of advice adding on to that is check out companies like Ethical Intelligence, it's actually run by one of our colleagues, Olivia Gamblin, and they are doing amazing work for basically coming in and consulting with people who are doing technology and making technology in big tech companies or small tech companies and who need ethical guidance and ethical consultation. And I think that they're not the only ones who are doing this. There's a lot of people who can come in and help with very specific niche problems and issues that maybe a data scientist or a machine learning engineer or a website developer or a computer scientist might have not been trained to know what to do. And that's okay. So there's no shame in that. But there is something that needs to be done. So don't just sit with that. Do something with it. Reach out, talk to people, and get a conversation started.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, just quickly, I think the first thing is to do your dang research. So I think like I think that the folks, in my experience, the folks who are like really engaging with that discomfort of like what is happening downstream with what they're creating are kind of few and far between. And I hope there's more people because more discomfort at some point, just because I think it's really important to first, like, I think the first step is actually, before you get to that point, getting in touch with that. Like, what is really happening? What am I doing? What am I creating? Where is this thing that I'm creating going? Because, and again, I come from an engineering household, and so I think it's really easy to get into this, like, I have a problem to solve, and I'm going to solve it, and I'm not going to go, like, to where it's actually going to impact people down the line. And again, technology can have some wonderful impacts, right, as well as negative impacts. So I do want to name that. But I think the first thing is to do your research about what is going on out there. What are the hot topics? What should you be paying attention to in your specific field? And then after that research, like really getting in touch with where you're at emotionally with that. Like, is that okay with your moral framework? Do you know what your moral framework is? Do you know where your line is? Like, if your company asked you to do something, would you know when to say no? Or do you feel like you could say no? And that might tell you something as well. And then I think the last thing is that all of this is so complex. And something that Jess and I deal with a lot in talking to so many people about so many things is that there's a large amount of overwhelm, right? Especially right now, so many people are doing this work on responsible AI. It's come about, within the last like 6 years. And it's just, there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of like companies coming out, like, we need to make a statement right now. There's a lot of just stuff out there that can create overwhelm. And in my experience, especially as a minister, overwhelm can cause shutdown and a desire to do nothing whatsoever. And so I think if people, wherever they are, can just start where they are, as opposed to wanting to solve the entire system, and treat this more as a general movement. And a lot of our guests talk about that. This is a movement, and finding where you're situated and your own positionality, and then making change out of that. Like, what can you do in your company right now? And maybe your boss won't be chill with that. So what can you do in your cubicle, right? Can you put like a Black Lives Matter banner up there? Like, what can you do? I mean, maybe your cubicle is in your house right now, unfortunately, but where can you start pulling, right, from where you're situated right now? I think that's what my last piece of advice would be for that.
I mean, it also raises just the fact that there are so many different issues that are going on. And I think that for many of us, like, we're just not aware of all the different issues. And I'm also curious about your advice. I'm glad you addressed like feeling overwhelmed, because I also feel like that's also something that we can feel, like overwhelmed, not sure where to start. I'm powerless at my company. I see some things, but I don't think anything's going to ever get done. I'm just one voice here, and I also need a job. So I have to be very careful how I navigate this thing. So there's that. I'm glad you addressed that because that is a huge challenge. And then the other area is for those who maybe have just been doing their job and to solve the technology or the solutions they're working on is maybe going to cause a problem in the future. And maybe it's other areas, and they're just like, I don't even know. Like I'm working on something, and I'm not even aware of all the different ways. I'm asking your advice for the person who really wants to start getting educated. Like there's so many different ethical issues that are going on out there. Maybe they didn't take any data ethics courses in school, and they want to start being aware of the issues. They see what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. They want to get involved. They want to be able to make ethical decisions. And sometimes it's really, really hard when it's really complicated. And so, your advice for those who are ready to begin this journey of just getting educated and staying educated on the very important.
Yeah, so I think that the first step is to begin. Like the first step to beginning is to begin, right? And I think sometimes, whether it's writing a lengthy essay or whatever, it's the hardest thing to do is to get started. So I would say the first thing is to get started. But then the question is, right, how do you get started? And one of the amazing things that we've seen, even in the past, since COVID started, is the sheer amount of resources that have been created and institutes and institutions that have gotten a lot of funding to do this exact work, right? So there currently, I don't think, is like a centralized location for all these different resources and all these different institutes. And we can talk about some of them specifically, but I think a great place to start is our website at radicalai.org, and to make sure that, because we're trying to create a community here of folks and trying to be more of a centralized resource in that. And so if you look at some of the folks that we interviewed and kind of follow their organizations, because we're lifting both them up and also their organizations up because they're doing incredible work. That I think you just begin, like a good research paper, right? You just begin by continuing to trace down the bibliography. Although people are busy, right? So it's hard to do that. So a few good places to start, I would say, are the Algorithmic Justice League, led by Joy Bolamwini, and some other folks. The
Center for Critical Internet Inquiry by Sophia Noble and Sarah Roberts. They're doing some really great stuff. They're pretty new. I mean, Black and AI by Timnit Gebru and Rydia Abeba.
Data for Black Lives, as we mentioned earlier, whose CEO is Yeshi Milner. So there are these groups that are out there. We like to think of ourselves as in conversation with them, but also as kind of looking up to them as the folks who are leading the way. But I think, again, that important part is just to get started. And the resources are out there. And really just a quick Google search away. And in the same degree, like if folks are really looking to be involved, a lot of these organizations are looking for people to be involved, either to donate financially or to volunteer in some capacity or to take surveys or for research purpose. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can feel agency by getting involved with some of the asks that these organizations are asking for in the first place.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, I was also going to plug, of course, go to our website, radicalai.org, listen to all the episodes. I think that's a great starting point. And, obviously, besides the fact that it's a shameless plug, it's just sort of a way to dive into a lot of the issues that are in conversation right now. And then, maybe some episodes don't make any sense to you and maybe you don't really care about any of them. Maybe some episodes really resonate with you and dive into that feeling that you are feeling from hearing some of these conversations, especially if you hear anybody come on the show or anybody doing any research that makes you feel uncomfortable. That's also something that Dylan and I are really passionate about in this project, is to try to invite people to sit in that discomfort. And if you find an issue that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's good. And if you listen to us on our podcast talking with somebody about their research that has to do with some sort of, I don't know, privacy problem, fairness problem, bias, accountability problem, whatever it is, and it makes you feel weird and uncomfortable, that means we're doing our job, because this stuff is
Mm.
tricky. It's not easy to talk about. And that's why we need to talk about it, because we've been ignoring these things for so long. So don't avoid starting, like Dylan was saying, don't avoid starting just because you feel uncomfortable, or you feel like you're not qualified, or you feel like you have no social science background and that you're not somebody who's a social scientist. No, this isn't social science and humanities versus computer science. This is humanity. This is just being a human, and technology is a part of society. So if you choose to ignore one side or the other, then you're always going to have to sit in that discomfort in some way, and you won't really be able to reason about some of these issues. And I'm going to add on to this too. This isn't for the person who's already been educated and is sitting as a data scientist, because unless you're planning on going back to school, this wouldn't really apply to you. But I really encourage, and this is coming from a biased standpoint because this is part of my PhD research, I really encourage anybody who's sitting in a place where they have the ability to educate data scientists, and they're sitting in a place where they're educating computer scientists, technologists, coders, even social scientists, to talk about these issues in the classroom, and include even just a simple ethical speculation module in the computer science classroom, something that gives people the ability to think about the possible unintended consequences of technology that they're creating. And it doesn't mean that we know everything that's going to happen. I mean, when facial recognition software was created, nobody could ever predict what could have been used for, or what it could have been used for, in all the goods and bad ways. But we can reason about the potential goods and the potential bads and think, well, is this technology worth it for us to create in the first place? And that all starts with starting.
Okay, so I love that you talked about being uncomfortable is like a signal that you're on the right path, because you're now getting educated, and there's an area that we might need to be growing in when you start to sense that uncomfortable feeling. And I'm wondering, like, as podcasters, as hosts of the Radical AI podcast, how you deal with some of these very uncomfortable conversations, because you're having to like host a show dealing with these topics. And like I said, you're probably also processing through, and you're trying to like have the courage to like, let's address this, this topic. That's a lot of work to address these topics. And I'm kind of curious, as podcast hosts, as educators, how are you kind of processing these kind of uncomfortable topics in a show?
So one of the lessons that I gathered from my years in ministry was that my job, no matter what I'm doing, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right? And so there's this desire for me to there's a lot of folks out there, probably including myself, who are in positions of some level of power or authority, who could be doing more, who know that there's something off about some of the systems, but who are really comfortable either in their way of life, or just don't want to deal with it, or don't want to see it, whatever the it is that might be making them uncomfortable, or might be an injustice out in the world. And so I view my role as a podcaster to afflict them in some way, as Jess was saying, to cause some level of discomfort, because that's how change happens, is some level of discomfort. No one changes because they're super happy with everything they're doing in their life.
That's right.
Because change sucks. Like, change is really hard to do.
Yes.
And especially like deep and abiding change that has to do with our biases about how we live into the world, and our identity and all of that. And then there's a lot of folks who are really struggling right now out there, who are trying to figure out what to do, and who are just looking for knowledge that they're not alone in this. And so I feel like that's another purpose of my job as a podcaster, as our job as the Radical AI podcast. But to answer your question more directly, these are incredibly difficult, multi-layered, to some degree impossible topics to get at, especially in like an hour-long episode of a podcast, right? And especially when it comes to like sexism and racism, it's and I think this is something that Jess and I are kind of like tied together with in terms of talking about it, but also different because we bring different identities. For myself as a straight white man, like a lot of my research this past year has been about like what would it look like to bring white male accountability into AI product design, right? Like what could that look like? And that was based off of representation work that Timnit was doing. But like what can I do as a podcaster who like I'm very aware, even in this interview, right, of like how much space I'm taking up versus how much space Jess is taking up. And I think there needs to be just a level of intentionality and also a level of just remaining curious about those power systems that are at play. And thankfully, we have a community that's willing to hold us accountable to that. So I wouldn't say that we've gotten into any like big tussles, but we've definitely gotten some, Twitter messages from folks that we really respect, just being like, no, that you shouldn't use that logo. Like, no, you shouldn't. And so it's just a matter of, I think for us in those difficult conversations, especially around race right now in the US, remaining open and curious and willing to be wrong and name our own positionality as white folks. And for myself as a white man in this.
Yeah. And even, I'm going to definitely ditto that curiosity word. I think that's really important for both Dylan and I and anybody who's in this AI ethics space. And then also humility, definitely. And that comes with that decentering. And three other words and verbs that were coming up for me is actually words that are taken from some interviews that we've done with just some amazing scholars in this space. And the first word is to be compassionate, and that comes from Mary L. Gray. And so to be compassionate towards others, but also to ourselves, and to know that we're not always going to do everything perfectly. And also along with that, just to be kind, both to others and ourselves. And that's from John C. Havens. And lastly, the word that always sticks out and seems to come up in a lot of our interviews is from the amazing scholar Ruha Benjamin, and that's love. So to feel love for ourselves and for this community and for everyone. And that can be such a driving force in this space.
Beautiful. And I want to thank you both for your courage to be addressing these topics that can be extremely uncomfortable, very complicated issues, bringing on guests that you may or may not agree with just to host the conversation, to hear different points of view and expose the data community to these very important discussions, because that's all about education. And it is super hard work, like the work you guys are doing, addressing these topics that make us feel uncomfortable, that make us question our own thinking. It can cause a lot of anxiety, it can cause a lot of self-doubt. And so it takes a lot of courage to like be out there, being willing to make a mistake, to say the wrong thing in a live interview, to realize and just own up to, like, I didn't say that right. I probably should have said it this way next time. But that takes a lot of courage and humility. So I want to give you guys props for helping to lead these conversations, to expose the world to important discussions. So thank you for all your work. Again, for those who missed it maybe in the beginning, where do they go? Where do they download your podcast?
Sure. So the first place to go is radicalai.org, which is our home base. That's our website. You can find all our episodes, all of our partnerships, our blog, which we should probably update soon. So hard to stay on top of a blog, even during quarantine. So there's a lot of different ways to get connected there. I think specifically people can connect with us. The best way to connect with us is either via email, which you can find on the website, or via Twitter. We're at Radical AI Pod. And specifically in the past week from when we're recording this, we have launched a Patreon page as we continue to grow as an organization to help fund some of that development as we move towards being more of an educational nonprofit beyond just the podcast. And so hopefully we can put that in the show notes for folks if they feel so called to donate.
And for those that want to be like really involved in your community, is there a community page for them, a Slack account, anything like that they should know about?
Ooh, not yet, but that's a great idea. For now, go through all of our followers. That seems to be like a big part of the AI ethics hub, but this is a huge space on Twitter. So I just recommend if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter. And if you're looking for a place to start, never hesitate to reach out. And we love getting messages from fans and just interested anyone. So send us a message and we'll get back to you, and maybe we'll even set up a meeting to chat and we can send you in hopefully the right direction.
And we're also happy to chat individually. Obviously, Jesse and I both have very different specialties. So if anyone has like specific questions about anything that we've said on the show, just feel free to reach out to us on Twitter or via email. We're easy to find. just Google our names. You'll find us.
Awesome. Well, Dylan and Jesse, thank you so much for being on Data Talk.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Data Talk podcast. We share new shows every week, and you can find the full catalog of previous episodes, including YouTube videos, on our Experian news blog. You can get access to the full catalog by going to experian.com/datatalk. And we always love hearing from our community, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future shows or guests you'd like to hear from, please let us know. You can leave a comment on iTunes, or you can reach out to us on Twitter at Experian Data Lab. You can also email me directly. My email is michael.delgado@experian.com. Take care, and we'll chat next week.